Hello, and welcome to the on-chain fundamentals portion of the newsletter for July 5th. So today I want to talk about some fairly interesting goings on in the DeFi ecosystem. We're starting to get some very interesting mechanisms forming. And you can see obviously in the this CoinDesk article here that there's actually more DAI in Compound than there are DAI in the world right now. Which is something a bit strange to kind of get your head around, but we'll talk through some of these mechanics. But the reason I wanted to really bring this topic up and kind of explore what's going on and further on where I think the market could go as a result of this is just we're starting to see Compound and Maker really are the two largest DeFi protocols by a fairly substantial margin. And the way they function is by depositing and withdrawing. So it's basically a money market of supplying collateral and then lending against that, whether to yourself or to somebody else. So we're starting to see that Compound is actually influencing the behavior or let's call it the tokenomics or the system design of Maker. So we've got these two very large protocols, and the governance decisions and the protocol design decisions, which are iterating fairly quickly, a little bit too quickly for my liking, but they are iterating quickly, and they're starting to actually influence each other in a non-trivial way, in potentially in a way that could actually break each other's system, and we'll explore the mechanism behind that. But just to kind of go into this headline, what's been going on in the DeFi ecosystem is this notion of liquidity mining, and in particular for the comp token. So the comp token is the governance token of Compound. The reason it exists is for people to make governance decisions, and ultimately the reason that you would speculate on comp is because you believe that at some time in the future, comp holders will vote in some kind of rent-seeking behavior, which is kind of where they're going with this at the end of the day. It's not there now. There's no value accrual to comp. It's purely a speculative governance token at this point. But the concept is that Compound becomes very large, and we assume DeFi takes over the world and so on and so forth. And the assumption is that comp voters will eventually put in some mechanism of fee burn or fee capture or some incentive to hold comp as a cash producing asset. That's the long term view. So it's not there now, but the idea is that we can assume people will act in their best interest and vote that in the future. Consider that with whatever framework you think is appropriate. Now, what's been going on is people have basically been the rules of comp mining or liquidity mining was that you would earn comp proportional to the interest rate, whether you're a supplier, so the interest that you're earning, or as a borrower. If you're paying a high amount of interest, you're gaining a large amount of comp. Now, because of the price performance, the very, very high valuation of the comp token, it reached $300. I think it's about $180 at the moment. The return on investment, if you're paying 6, 7, 8% borrowing something like Basic Attention Token, which is a highly speculative asset as is, you are still making money in the long run. And again, you need to be a fairly substantial player to make this actually feasible. I wouldn't, anyone who's under, $10,000 worth of collateral or borrows and all that kind of stuff, it's just not economical. Even the gas fees alone blow you out. So we're talking about, whales more or less, and venture capitalists and the like who are taking advantage of this. They're basically borrowing or going either leverage long or leverage short on speculative assets like Basic Attention Token in particular was kind of the reason for this. And using DAI as kind of you will borrow against one collateral and then you will lock DAI in to put in more collateral, right? So you will borrow Basic Attention Token to get the high interest rate mining of comp. You will sell Basic Attention Token for DAI, lock the DAI in. You now have more collateral in the system, and then you rinse repeat. You re-borrow Basic Attention Token, which more or less is going leverage short on BAT. So they borrow it, they sell it for DAI on Uniswap or some other trade market, and then lock it back in. So that's what people have been doing, or these large players have been doing. And obviously that's creating a large amount of debt in the system. And what we're actually seeing is that there's a process of rehypothecation here, because somebody is borrowing Basic Attention Token, buying DAI, putting it in. Someone else is doing the opposite, maybe with USDC, right? Where they're actually borrowing DAI, buying USDC, and you've got these kind of liquidity loops that people are making. Now, at the end of the day, this is actually not, I'm not convinced that this is appropriately called liquidity mining, because for every piece of collateral that someone puts in there, which is liquidity, someone else is borrowing debt against that, sometimes the same person. So every piece of collateral actually has already been assigned a fairly substantial amount of debt associated with it. So I'm not really a fan of the notion of liquidity mining because it's kind of not true. It's actually rehypothecation, which is kind of how we get to the point here where we've actually got more DAI locked in compound than there are DAI in existence, because you've got this cycle. And I believe that compound, the way they've measured this, now I don't think that they've minted DAI. I believe what's going on here is that somebody's borrowed and rehypothecated DAI multiple times, right? So you deposit DAI, borrow USDC, buy DAI, deposit DAI, and that counts as 2 times the DAI, right? So it's kind of double counting in these instances. So to give you an order of scale here, we're talking about the amount of DAI on chain being 108 million, and the amount of DAI that's been rehypothecated into MakerDAO is basically 3 times. You've got 3 times the amount of DAI that's been re-input to the system. It's kind of double counted a number of times. So it's a little bit of a, this is not a great scenario. And the Compound team has come to this realization. They understand this is going on, and they have a governance proposal which is currently going on, where the idea is, the way the system is designed at the moment, you earn comp based on how much you're earning or paying in interest, right? So if you're paying, which is why basic attention token with a very high interest rate is favorable at this point in time. That's what they want to avoid. So what they plan to change is, rather than the amount of interest you pay as a percentage, what they're planning to do, or they've already executed this proposal as far as I'm aware, they've actually swapped it over so it's all based on the dollar value that you've provided or borrowed. So it's no longer the interest rate you're paying. You're no longer being rewarded with comp based on the interest rate. You're being rewarded in comp based on the dollar value supplied or borrowed. Now, in my personal opinion, I don't think that they should be providing comp to anybody who's borrowing. Or if they're going to, it should be something like 80% goes to liquidity providers supplying money markets, and like 20%, or maybe lower, a little bit less, whatever the balance is, but certainly not 50-50. At the moment, 50% goes to suppliers, 50% to borrowers, and that's incentivizing this liquidity loop, and it's actually incentivizing debt, and it's incentivizing people pushing their interest rates to the maximum limit. Or their utilization of their debt vehicles to the maximum limit. What I believe is more sensible is to have a higher incentive for suppliers than borrowers. But that's a separate discussion. And quite frankly, people like me, or any of us, even combined, would never have enough comp to even remotely sway these decisions. Anyway, so this is kind of what's going on in the governance proposal. And just to kind of illustrate my last point, you can see here that I think there's something like 2.6 or 2.8 million comp currently in circulation. And you can see here that, there's a couple of VCs, Paradigm, there's individuals from Synthetics. These large VC or projects have 100,000, 60,000. These are all projects, Argent, Instadapp, 60, 30, 30. Fairly substantial holdings, individuals, 10,000 comp tokens. Now, once you get down into the public, you can see here that we're talking about thousands, and then bang, we drop to individuals. And I kind of consider these, these are named VCs or companies. Once you get down to individual level, you're talking about 100, 13, 9, 5. I mean, what say do these people actually have? Nothing, really. They may as well not spend the gas, because, you get 3 of these guys, 4 of these guys to collude, and that's it. The government's proposal passes, right? So all of these guys are for this particular distribution patch. Now, what they're changing this to is the dollar value system. Now, what this system actually incentivizes is, instead of people borrowing basic attention token and speculating on a speculative asset, so it does achieve the goal, what this incentivizes is someone doing the DAI to USD loop, right? So taking out one stable coin and then basically, you want to pay as little interest as possible now, because that becomes a cost. And what you actually want to maximize is the amount of dollar value in the system. So what you actually want to do is, let's go to the, this is Instadapp. And you can see here that if you were to borrow basic attention token, you'd be paying 6%. If you were to borrow rep, it'd be 2.3, 0x, 15%. So previously, these guys would have been where people were comp mining, because you're paying the highest interest rate. Now you want to do the dollar value. And you can see up here that we have USDC, we're talking about 2.8, and you can actually see that these here were used to be about 2%. And you can see that these interest rates are already starting to rise, and we'll talk about that mechanism. But if you were to supply, let's say, if you were to borrow DAI, swap it for USDC, and then supply USDC, and then re-borrow DAI, swap it for USDC, and then supply, you can see that your borrowing cost is 2.8%, your supplying cost is 2.8%, so these two actually cancel each other out, you break even. So you're borrowing DAI and depositing USDC, right? That process. And you're paying the minimum interest. But by doing that, because they're both stable coins, in inverted commas, you can borrow and lend as many dollar value as possible, maximizing your comp return. So you can see this new governance proposal achieves what it wants by dropping the incentive to use speculative tokens and move that to dollar denominated or stable coin assets. Now the problem with this is that the demand for DAI is now going to be very, very high, and we've already seen there's a large amount of DAI in the system, right? There's a large demand for DAI to be participating in this comp mining process, and there is a concern that some of the people in the MakerDAO system have talked about, where the demand for DAI could actually be so high that now when the demand for DAI is not pegged to the dollar like USDC is, because you can't redeem it for dollars, there's not a direct arbitrage opportunity there. The demand for DAI, if it goes up, like any other coin, if there's not enough supply to meet demand, the price will rise. And I believe we've already seen this starting to play out. Let me jump to our friend CoinMarketCap, which is obviously not the best thing, but it should have the price for DAI. What we're actually starting to see is the price for DAI is starting to rise because there is a demand for that lockup. And you can see we're starting to get above the peg. Previously, I think it was up at 1.05, I think it got to recently in a small spike. So you're starting to see that the demand, and you can see this blue line here, which is the market cap, or you can probably better consider this as the supply of DAI. And what we're starting to see is a very substantial uptick in demand for DAI, right? So people are trying to borrow against their Ethereum in Maker, mint that DAI, and then participate in this comp mining liquidity process. Now, there is a risk that will actually push the DAI peg too high. Now, if you sell your DAI, if you lock up your Ethereum in Maker and you borrow DAI, and then you sell that DAI for, let's say you want to go leverage long on ETH, right? You then swap that DAI for ETH. You are technically short DAI, because you still have a DAI denominated debt of whatever you borrowed, but you now own an asset that is not DAI. Now, if the DAI peg goes from 1.1 cents to 1.05 to 1.1, if the DAI price starts to go up, you now need to pay more to buy that DAI to pay off your debt. It's actually very similar to a deflationary spiral where the costs involved with paying off your debts actually go higher because the money becomes more expensive. The DAI value gets harder to buy with other assets. So what we could actually see here is the DAI peg start to get pushed very high. Now, if the DAI price goes higher, the standard approach for Maker has been to lower the stability fee, right, to promote people minting more. But the problem is here that people are already minting more in order to put it into compound. So, and to actually further that problem, the stability fee right now, if we go to the MakerDAO vault, the stability fee is actually already at 0%. So much like the central banks of today, Maker is already at a stability fee of 0, and yet they are still seeing the peg go higher. This is a real problem, because this means that there is no cost for people to mint DAI in Maker, which means that minting DAI is cheap. People are demanding DAI, which is pushing the peg higher, which will further incentivize people to mint DAI, because if the peg goes to 1.05, right, you're getting 5 cents on the dollar, you could in theory mint DAI at 0% interest and then sell it for USDC, right, and you locked in a 5% immediate gain. But the problem is that you could just go into compound and then borrow more assets, more ETH, to then lock into Maker. And you can see how very quickly the supply of DAI could increase substantially, but the peg may not return. So the incentive structure of Compound, of this comp liquidity mining process, and the immense demand for stable coins that this has created, in particular DAI, is actually has the potential to break the peg to the upside for MakerDAO. And they are already at the zero lower bound. There could be no way for them in the current system paradigm to actually correct the course of this, because they're already at zero, right? This is literally the central bank problem. They cannot get enough money in the system to feed the demand. MakerDAO is about to experience the exact same liquidity crunch that we've got going on in the real world. Now, one option that they do have, which I think is something that might come up as a discussion point, is actually to go from the stability fee of zero to actually bump it up to actually drop it down to negative. It's very possible that this thing could actually go negative in order to incentivize people sucking money back into the system. And quite interestingly, Ross Ulbricht, who was famously known for Silk Road, right? Who's unfortunately in prison as a result of that. So he was the creator of the Silk Road website. He actually released a paper recently on Medium that was talking about this whole concept, the idea of MakerDAO should actually be negative interest by default. And the reason being, if you are a liquidity provider, aka someone locking up ETH, you should be getting paid for that liquidity. By actually taking on risk and minting DAI, you should be rewarded for that. Now, that's a really interesting model and potentially something we could actually see come to pass. We could actually see Maker go negative as the default procedure in order to combat this. But I think at the end of the day, we've got this very interesting process going on where you've got Compound influencing the behavior of Maker. And these are complex systems. It's becoming, with the gas fees as well, it's becoming increasingly difficult for people to actually manage and deal with these systems. So it's something to keep an eye on. The truth is we don't really know how this is kind of going to manifest longer term. But the reason I've jumped onto DeFi Pulse is there is a potential. So what we've seen recently is that a lot of these DeFi tokens have really started to move, right? They've had substantial price gains in Lend and KNC and all these different DeFi tokens. And a lot of that was actually driven by this whole speculative liquidity mining and, just the hype that kind of came around it. Now, I still am very confident that we're talking about a very small pool of people who are participating in this space. But that's really what I think has been driving this current price movement. Now, I do believe that we're probably getting to the end of that, especially now that the demand for these speculative BAT tokens and 0x and paying high interest and all that kind of stuff, I think that's now going to peter off with this new governance proposal, unless they change it again, which we don't know. But what we're seeing, and the reason I've gone to DeFi Pulse, is we can actually see there's been a fairly substantial uptick since that proposal passed for people locking ETH in Maker to mint DAI. Now, because the interest rate is zero, and it's possible, there's no guarantees here, it's possible that they have to go negative interest rate to deal with this. I believe there is a potential use case here or a potential fundamental reason why we could actually see some of the DeFi tokens, the profits from that roll back into Ethereum, back into the ETH token itself. So there's kind of two cases that I want to lay out. The first one is the bear case, just so we can kind of get the risks out in the open. Clearly, what am I at? 18 minutes now. 18 minutes, and I've been talking about what I would call complexity. There's a lot of moving pieces to this, and I know that there's probably some things that we've talked about so far that even I haven't quite got my head around. I'm positive of that. It's a really complex system. And now that we're seeing interplay between two large protocols, and no doubt there'll be more of these, it's not exactly getting simpler. There's a lot of moving pieces. So the bear case in all of this is that we only need one bug, one serious problem to happen, and this whole DeFi house of cards could unwind in a very unpleasant fashion. Combine that with a very expensive gas price, it's very difficult for people to get out and to escape their leverage positions. There is a lot of debt in this system. I don't like it. I think it's a little bit over the top and risky. It's kind of the design. It's kind of by design. So, if you assume that DeFi is okay, then that's, and going as planned, which it is kind of going as planned, which has a layer of, unplanned as well. But it's something to bear in mind. So the bear case is there is what I think is systemic risk and an exceptional amount of leverage that will unwind at some point. So that's something to keep your head on. Now, the bull case is I think that all the DeFi tokens are substantially overvalued. The only one that I think is kind of a little bit separate to all of this is synthetics. I think it still has, now in terms of what value it should be, I don't know. I haven't done the study to look into that just yet. But it is, as you can see, that I haven't talked about synthetics and all of this, and that's because they're kind of a separate entity. And that's actually a positive, right? They're not tied up in all of this mix because they've got their own stable coin, they've got their own Oracle system. It's kind of a separate layer to all of this. So it's kind of shielded from a large portion of this systemic risk that's going on between Compound and Maker. So outside of synthetics, I think that the rest of these tokens are substantially overvalued. And the last thing we'll look at is a research piece that one of these investment firms did that comes to the same conclusion. But I think that some of these profits will probably roll into Ethereum. So let's talk about the bull case. If we assume that we don't get a complete unraveling of the systemic risk, I believe some of these profits have a good potential to actually roll into Ethereum. And we've seen that the ETH price really hasn't responded to a lot of this. And I think it probably will eventually. And I think it could actually start looking a bit like, how the Bitcoin price moves when Bitcoin moves, appreciates in value, people make money, and then they roll that profit into altcoins. And then that's kind of a cyclical, then alts start to sell off and Bitcoin rallies and you get this kind of to and fro. We could very well see the similar thing with Ethereum. The reason being, it's so easy with these DEXs to swap in and out of KNC to ETH, and once you get a bit of market momentum, people move into ETH as the safe haven, and they don't have to use centralized exchanges. So I think that's a possible bull case here. The other one is that the incentive right now is to actually mint ETH to create DAI, right? Now, if DAI goes to a higher peg, you could actually mint that DAI and then buy USDC, lock in that profit. The risk there is that if the DAI peg keeps going up, you are also now short DAI. So there's a risk element to there. It's not free money, but there is an incentive to actually try and defend that peg because people can basically mint a 5% return instantly. So there's one case. The other case is I think they might go into negative interest rates, which means that if you have ETH locked in Maker, you should in theory be paid for that service. That's actually a strong value capture mechanism. So if we go down that path, which again is speculation on my part, but I think is probably something we could see, that is a potential mechanism for ETH to again accrue value, because by having ETH, locking it in Maker and minting DAI, you could actually get paid for that service. So that's something to keep an eye on. So my kind of take home from all of this, I think DeFi tokens are overvalued right now. Let's go to, here's a review that one of these investment firms did on this whole process. And if you were to look through some of these one-liners, Maker right now at 0% stability fee, there's no burn of Maker, so there's actually no token capture whatsoever. I think Maker is immensely overvalued as a token, right? The platform still works, right? It still works well. And there's clearly demand for DAI. The problem is Maker has no way of capturing that value. I think what they should be doing is basically saying that you need to pay whatever negative interest rates in Maker. I think that's where it will end up going. So you pay, doesn't matter what side of the coin, what side of the interest rate it's on. Compound, I really think that the comp token is well and truly overvalued for what it's doing. There's no value capture at the moment, and I think we're a long way from that being the case. So I think it's overvalued. We talked about the Aave protocol, the LEN protocol. I agree it's interesting, but I really don't think that there's much demand or value capture. We're not seeing anywhere near the same fee burn. I think KNC had a better fee burn potential. A lot of these old school coins like 0x really don't have any, I had a look at 0x this morning. There's really very little fees flowing through it relative to its valuation. So I think 0x has a very poor value capture at this point in time. SNX, you can see here that even they've picked best-in-class team, rich valuation, could be worth paying for the optionality. I would tend to agree that it's, of all of these tokens, I think SNX is probably the most, the highest quality of them and probably the most likely to continue to accrue value. I have not looked at Ren or Rune. Both of these I know there's a lot of hype at the moment, and I will be looking at them in the future, so stay tuned for those. Again, they seem to have good projects, but Herculean tasks. They've got a lot of work to do. I believe that these are trying to bring cross-chain DEX capabilities and things like that, trying to bring Bitcoin and Zcash and stuff onto ETH. So there's a lot of stuff going on in that this what's kind of going on at the moment. I think if you were to take home some messages, there is some systemic risk that's starting to be built into DeFi. I don't have a good idea about the likelihood of some of this unwinding, but I do believe that there is far too much debt locked up in the system. I think we could very well see a fairly savage unwinding, and all that we'll need is a substantial price dip, maybe even not substantial, price dip in across the board. I think that a lot of these DeFi tokens are overvalued and could very well be sold off. I think that would be a bull case for ETH, much the same way that alt selling off is normally a bull case for Bitcoin. So I think we could see some profit rotation there. I think the incentive is there to mint DAI, and that requires Ethereum. So I think there's a bull case there. And the speculative case is that ETH vaults could actually get paid negative interest in the short term, which I think is actually a very good idea. And I'll be interested to see whether that shows up. So complexity is the enemy of security. Always keep that in mind. If you are using any of these systems, be very aware that the gas prices are extremely high. You will spend something like $10 to achieve any of these kind of mint and burn and DAI and all that kind of stuff. You will pay in fees. Be aware of that. Be aware there is systemic risk, and it is a risky process. There is starting to get very complex mechanisms between Compound and Maker. We don't know how this is going to play out. It's not great. There is too much debt in the system in my eyes, but there is a potential profit rotation into the ETH token. So as the safe haven of the system, to me that makes sense. So I think that's kind of a general overview of what's going on. Granted, albeit complex, but look, if you have any questions, feel free to, or you have any insights of your own that you've kind of been looking at this stuff, let me know. Let's talk about it in the Discord and try and nut out where the opportunities are. But at this point in time, I would be cautious and certainly looking at Ethereum. If you were looking at any of these tokens, I think Ethereum's the most likely to actually capture some value off the back of that. So until next week, and I'll see you in the Discord room. Thanks.